have you ever felt like something was watching you in the dark? In today's video, we dive into 6 terrifying stories where the supernatural becomes all too real. From seances gone wrong to shadowy figures haunting families for years, and possessions that push loved ones to the edge, these chilling encounters will make you question what truly lurks in the shadows. If you're ready for spine-tingling suspense, stay until the end and tell us where you're watching from and what time, because once you start, you won't want to stop. The Haunted Mickey Doll. When Evan first moved into the old Victorian house on the outskirts of a small New England town, he was struck by its eerie beauty. The high ceilings, creaking wooden floors, and grand staircases gave the place a sense of history, but there was also something unsettling about the house. It had been abandoned for years before he bought it, and now, as he unpacked his belongings, the empty rooms felt colder than they should have. It was during his second day of unpacking that he found the doll. Tucked away on a dusty shelf in the attic, the Mickey Mouse doll looked old, its colors faded and its fabric worn from time. Its large, cartoonish eyes seemed out of place in the gloomy attic, staring blankly ahead as if waiting for someone to notice it. Evan brushed off the dust and decided to place the doll on a shelf in the living room, thinking it might add a bit of charm to the otherwise stark space. For the next few days, Evan continued settling into his new home. He didn't think much about the doll. After all, it was just a small, forgotten piece of the house's history. But as the nights grew longer, strange things began to happen. It started with the soft sounds. At first, Evan thought it was just the house settling, the usual creaks and groans of an old building. But soon, the sounds became more distinct. At night, he would hear what sounded like footsteps in the hallway outside his bedroom, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was moving just beyond the door. He would rush to check, but every time, the hallway would be empty, the silence almost mocking him. Then, one evening, as Evan sat reading in the living room, he noticed something strange. The Mickey doll had moved. It was subtle, just a shift in its position on the shelf, but it was undeniable. The doll, which had been sitting upright earlier, now leaned to the side, as if it had been knocked or pushed. Puzzled, Evan straightened it back up, dismissing the movement as accidental. But the next morning, it had moved again. This time, it was more obvious. The doll was now turned completely around, its back facing the room. A chill ran down Evan's spine as he stared at the motionless figure. He told himself there must be a logical explanation, perhaps the drafty house had somehow shifted the doll. But deep down, he felt an unsettling sense of dread, a nagging feeling that something was very wrong. Over the next few days, the doll continued to move, each time more dramatically. Evan began finding it in different positions around the room, lying flat on the shelf, tilted forward as if about to fall, and once, it was even sitting on the floor. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing day, the house's once quiet atmosphere now filled with a creeping sense of unease. Evan couldn't explain it, but he knew one thing: something wasn't right with that doll. The doll's unexplained movements continued, and as each day passed, the sense of unease grew stronger within Evan. He had always been a rational man, dismissing anything supernatural as mere fiction, but now, he couldn't ignore the strange occurrences. The old Victorian house, once filled with potential charm, now felt more like a prison, its heavy silence broken only by the unsettling activities centered around the Mickey doll. One evening, Evan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the doll from across the room. It sat on the shelf, still and quiet, but there was something deeply wrong about the way it seemed to dominate the space. Its eyes, lifeless yet disturbingly focused, seemed to follow his every move. He tried to shake off the feeling, but the tension in the room hung thick in the air, making it impossible to relax. That night, as Evan lay in bed, he was jolted awake by a loud thud. His heart raced as he sat up, straining to hear anything else in the quiet house. The sound had come from the living room. Slowly, he climbed out of bed, grabbing a flashlight from his nightstand. The wooden floor creaked beneath his feet as he made his way down the dark hallway. When he reached the living room, his breath caught in his throat. The bookshelf where he had placed the doll was now in disarray. Several of the books and small trinkets that had once lined the shelves were scattered on the floor, and at the center of the chaos was the Mickey doll, now lying face down in the middle of the room. Evan's pulse quickened. He hadn't touched the shelf, and there was no way the doll could have knocked everything over on its own. But there it was, surrounded by toppled objects, as if it had been the cause of the mess. He hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment settle on him. Something had moved the doll, and it wasn't him. Evan bent down to pick it up, his hands trembling slightly as he placed it back on the shelf. The air felt heavy, charged with an invisible tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. For the next few days, Evan kept a closer eye on the doll. It continued to move, always shifting positions when he wasn't looking. But more than that, other things began to happen. He would hear objects shifting in the house, books falling from shelves, doors creaking open on their own. It was as if the house itself had begun to rebel, and the doll was at the center of it all. One afternoon, Evan returned home from running errands to find the doll lying on the floor again, but this time, it wasn't alone. Several other toys he had placed on a nearby shelf, old, dusty items left behind by the previous owners, had also fallen. But they hadn't simply tumbled off the shelf, they had been pushed, as if something, or someone, had deliberately knocked them over. The doll's presence had taken on a new, sinister energy. Evan could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Something was in the house with him, and it wasn't friendly. The unsettling occurrences in the house had become more frequent. Every night, Evan would hear sounds that seemed to come from nowhere, objects shifting, soft creaks in the floorboards, and the occasional, eerie rustling of fabric, as if something was moving quietly through the house. But what unsettled him most was the Mickey doll. It had taken on a life of its own, its movements becoming more bold and impossible to ignore. One particularly cold evening, Evan sat in the living room, his nerves already on edge. The house was dark, save for the dim light of a single lamp beside him. The air was thick with tension, and the feeling of being watched had become almost unbearable. The doll sat on the shelf, as it always did, but tonight it seemed different. Its presence felt heavier, as if it had taken control of the room. Evan stood up to head to bed, hoping that sleep might offer some relief from the creeping dread that now filled his home. As he turned off the lamp and stepped into the hallway, a faint noise stopped him in his tracks. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew louder, a sound that chilled him to his core. Laughter. It echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls and filling the empty rooms. It wasn't the light-hearted laughter of a child, but something darker, more sinister. The sound was warped, as though it had been twisted by something evil. Evan's heart pounded as he stood frozen in place, his eyes wide with fear. The laughter seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding him. He forced himself to move, walking slowly down the hallway toward his bedroom, but the laughter followed him, growing louder with every step. His breathing quickened as the sound became more menacing, filling his mind with thoughts he didn't want to entertain. Was the doll laughing? Was it something else, something even worse? Evan reached the door to his bedroom, his hand shaking as he reached for the knob. Just as he was about to open it, the doorknob shook violently. The sudden movement startled him, and he stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The doorknob rattled again, this time more forcefully, as if something was on the other side, trying to break through. The laughter continued, filling the air with its malevolent energy. Evan backed away from the door, his body trembling with fear. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain: he was no longer alone in the house. The door shook once more, the knob twisting as if it were about to burst open. Evan couldn't bring himself to move any closer. He stood paralyzed, trapped between the demonic laughter and the violent shaking of the door. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the laughter stopped. The doorknob went still, the room falling into a suffocating silence. But the air in the house was thick with the lingering presence of whatever had been there. Evan knew it hadn't left, it was just waiting. The silence that followed the terrifying laughter was almost worse than the sound itself. Evan stood frozen in the hallway, his body still trembling from the encounter. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and it was clear that whatever had been in the house hadn't left. It was lurking, watching, waiting for its next move. He could feel it in his bones. The presence that haunted his home was growing stronger. For the next few days, Evan lived in a state of constant fear. He avoided the living room as much as possible, knowing that the Mickey doll had become the center of the strange, terrifying occurrences. But no matter where he went in the house, he felt the weight of its gaze, as if the doll's lifeless eyes were following him from room to room. The nights were the worst. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the shadows, sent his heart racing. He barely slept, and when he did, his dreams were filled with dark, twisted images, visions of the doll moving on its own, its fabric face stretching into an unnatural grin as it whispered things he couldn't understand. One night, after tossing and turning for hours, Evan finally decided he couldn't take it anymore. The fear had consumed him, and he needed answers. He couldn't explain why, but something about the doll felt wrong, as if it didn't belong in this world. It wasn't just an old toy, it was something far more dangerous. Determined to get rid of it once and for all, Evan grabbed a flashlight and made his way to the living room. The house was dark, the only sound the soft hum of the wind outside. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped into the room, his eyes immediately drawn to the shelf where the doll sat. But it wasn't there. The shelf was empty, save for a few scattered books and knickknacks. Panic surged through Evan's body as he frantically searched the room, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. The doll was nowhere to be found. It had moved again, but this time, it wasn't just a small shift in position, it had disappeared entirely. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. He hadn't moved it, and no one else had been in the house. So where was it? Just as he was about to leave the room, a soft thud echoed from upstairs. Evan's breath caught in his throat. The noise had come from his bedroom. Slowly, cautiously, he made his way up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he approached the bedroom door, he saw it, the doll, sitting upright in the center of his bed. Its faded eyes stared directly at him, and for the first time, Evan felt a sense of pure, unrelenting evil radiating from it. The air in the room was thick with tension, and the temperature had dropped sharply, the cold biting at his skin. The doll hadn't just moved, it had come for him. Evan stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the Mickey doll perched in the center of his bed. Its faded eyes seemed to hold a sinister intelligence, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The air in the room was cold, unnaturally so, and the oppressive weight of the presence he had felt for days was now overwhelming. It was no longer just a feeling, there was something dark and malevolent in the house, and it had revealed itself. His heart raced, fear gripping him like a vice. But despite the terror, Evan knew he couldn't run. He had tried ignoring it, brushing off the strange occurrences as mere coincidence, but now it was clear that the doll had been playing with him all along. And it wasn't going to stop. Slowly, he stepped into the room, his eyes locked on the doll. His breath came in shallow gasps as he approached, every fiber of his being screaming at him to leave, to get as far away from the house as possible. But something kept him rooted in place, some force stronger than his fear. As he stood over the bed, the doll remained perfectly still, its lifeless face frozen in a grotesque expression. Evan reached out, his hand trembling, and grabbed the doll by its arm. The moment his fingers closed around the fabric, a wave of cold washed over him, more intense than anything he had ever felt. The air in the room seemed to hum with energy, and the lights flickered violently before going out entirely. In the pitch-black darkness, Evan's grip on the doll tightened. His heart thundered in his chest, and his mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them good. He could feel the presence growing stronger, surrounding him, suffocating him with its sheer malevolence. Then, the laughter returned. It was louder this time, echoing through the house, filling every corner with its demonic resonance. It wasn't coming from outside the room. It was coming from the doll. The sound was warped, inhuman, and it sent a wave of terror through Evan's entire body. The door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang, and Evan stumbled backward, dropping the doll onto the floor. It landed with a soft thud, but the laughter continued, as if the house itself was mocking him. Desperate, Evan reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The room was alive with the sound of the twisted laughter, and the air had grown so cold that his breath fogged in front of him. He pounded on the door, shouting, but there was no escape. The malevolent presence was closing in, feeding on his fear. In a final act of desperation, Evan grabbed the doll again, this time throwing it across the room with all his strength. The laughter stopped abruptly, the house falling into an oppressive silence once more. The doll lay motionless on the floor, but the presence lingered, as if waiting for something. Evan collapsed to his knees, his body trembling from the cold and fear. He didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was clear: the doll wasn't just a toy. It was something far more sinister, and whatever it was, it wasn't finished with him yet. Trapped in a haunted home. Mateo had never expected much when his mother announced they were moving into a small duplex in a quiet neighborhood. After the divorce, life had been chaotic, and this move was supposed to offer them a fresh start. The house was old, with creaky floors and chipped paint, but it was affordable, and his mother seemed optimistic about the change. Mateo, however, couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that crept over him the moment they arrived. From the outside, the duplex looked unremarkable, a two-story building with overgrown bushes and a sagging porch. Inside, it was even less inviting. The rooms were dimly lit, and there was an ever-present chill in the air, despite the warm weather. Mateo's room was on the second floor, and directly below it was the basement, an area his mother warned him to avoid. She said the stairs were old and unstable, but Mateo couldn't help feeling there was more to her warning than just concern for his safety. The first few days passed quietly enough. Mateo and his mom worked on unpacking, filling the house with their belongings. But the sense of unease lingered, especially at night. It was subtle at first, small noises, like faint whispers carried on the breeze, or the feeling that someone was watching him as he moved through the house. He dismissed it, chalking it up to stress or the house settling. But then the strange occurrences began to escalate. Doors would slam shut without warning, even when there was no wind. Mateo often heard footsteps creaking through the hallways late at night, though when he checked, no one was there. Once, while he was in his room, he felt a sudden drop in temperature, as though the warmth had been sucked out of the air. It left him with an unsettling chill, a feeling that someone, or something, was there with him. His mother noticed the strange events as well. She mentioned hearing voices in the middle of the night and complained that objects around the house seemed to move on their own. But neither of them could explain what was happening, and they both tried to pretend that it was nothing, just their imaginations running wild. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was bathed in shadows, Mateo decided to explore the basement. His curiosity got the better of him, despite his mother's warnings. The old wooden door to the basement creaked open, revealing a set of rickety stairs descending into darkness. The air down there was thick and damp, and the scent of mildew hung heavy. As he took the first step, a deep sense of dread settled over him, but he pressed on, gripping the handrail tightly as he made his way down. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement stretched out before him, a large, empty space with cracked concrete walls and low-hanging pipes. But there was something else in the air down here, something darker and more menacing. And then he saw it, a shadow moving in the far corner of the room, too fast to be human, too solid to be a trick of the light. The shadow in the corner of the basement sent a wave of icy fear through Mateo. His breath caught in his throat as he stood frozen, staring into the darkness. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, and the sense of being watched had become undeniable. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, as if it was waiting for him to come closer. Mateo's instincts screamed for him to turn and run, but curiosity and fear held him in place. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly backed away, careful not to make any sudden movements. The creaking of the old wooden stairs under his feet fell deafening in the stillness of the basement. As soon as he reached the top, he slammed the basement door shut, breathing heavily. He didn't know what he had seen, but the basement was no longer just a creepy part of the house, it was something much worse. Mateo tried to shake off the experience, but the sense of dread followed him through the rest of the evening. He didn't mention the incident to his mother. She had been under enough stress with the move, and the last thing she needed was to worry about some ghost story. Besides, Mateo still wasn't sure what he had actually seen. It could have been a trick of the light, right? But as the days passed, things only got stranger. The slamming doors and footsteps in the hallway became a nightly occurrence. Mateo would lie awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the house, trying to convince himself it was just the old building settling. But it felt too deliberate, too intentional. His mother, too, was beginning to feel uneasy. One night, she mentioned waking up to the sound of someone whispering her name, only to find the house completely silent when she checked. The sense of being watched grew more intense. No matter where Mateo was in the house, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was observing him, lurking just beyond his line of sight. He started avoiding the basement entirely, keeping the door firmly shut at all times. But even that didn't stop the growing fear that the shadowy presence had escaped the confines of the basement and was now roaming the house freely. One evening, as Mateo sat in his room trying to focus on his homework, a loud bang echoed through the house. He jumped, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound had come from downstairs. Hesitant but knowing he couldn't ignore it, Mateo crept toward the noise. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he froze. The basement door was wide open. Cold fear gripped him. He knew for a fact that the door had been locked, he had checked it earlier. Yet here it was, ajar, as if something had come up from below. A soft creak echoed from the basement stairs, and Mateo felt a chill run down his spine. Whatever was down there hadn't left. Mateo's heart raced as he stood in front of the open basement door. The cold air that drifted from below felt unnatural, heavy with an eerie silence. He could barely breathe, every instinct telling him to run, to get as far away from the door as possible. But something stronger, something he couldn't explain, kept him rooted in place. He had to know what was down there. Summoning all his courage, Mateo grabbed the flashlight from the hallway drawer. The beam of light trembled as he pointed it into the basement, illuminating the top of the creaky wooden stairs. The darkness below seemed impenetrable, as if it was swallowing the light before it could reach the bottom. Mateo swallowed hard and slowly began to descend, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he reached the bottom, his breath came out in shaky gasps. The basement was cold, colder than it had any right to be. The light from his flashlight swept across the empty space, landing on the same corner where he had seen the shadowy figure before. For a moment, nothing seemed out of place, just the cracked walls and old pipes. But then the air shifted. From the corner of his eye, Mateo saw movement. His flashlight flickered as the figure from before began to materialize, emerging from the shadows like a nightmare coming to life. This time, it was unmistakable. The figure wasn't just a shadow, it was something far more sinister. Standing before him was a tall, gaunt figure with hollow, black eyes that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Its face was twisted into an unnatural grin, and its skin was as pale as bone. The presence radiated malevolence, its very form dripping with an ancient, evil energy that made Mateo's blood run cold. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there watching him, as if studying his fear. But then, slowly, it began to take a step forward. Mateo's heart pounded so hard he thought it might explode from his chest. He stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering as the figure approached, each step echoing with a low, guttural sound that chilled him to his core. Without thinking, Mateo did the only thing that came to his mind. He called out to the one thing he had always been taught could protect him, the name of God. As soon as the words left his mouth, the figure froze. Its black eyes widened, and a sound like a hiss escaped its lips. For a brief moment, Mateo felt a flicker of hope. The air in the room seemed to lighten, as if the darkness was retreating. But then the figure let out a low, growling laugh, its twisted grin widening even further. The light from Mateo's flashlight dimmed, and the figure began to move again, faster this time, more determined. Whatever it was, invoking God's name hadn't been enough to stop it. Mateo's legs felt like lead as he turned and bolted up the stairs, his mind racing with terror. The laughter echoed in his ears, following him all the way up, growing louder with each step. The door slammed shut behind him just as he reached the top, leaving him gasping for breath, his back pressed against the wall. But even with the door closed, Matteo knew the figure wasn't gone. It was still there, waiting in the shadows. Matteo stood with his back against the basement door, his heart racing and his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The figure, with its hollow black eyes and malevolent grin, was no longer confined to the basement. It was in the house now, and there was no escaping it. The oppressive weight of its presence pressed down on him, making the air feel thick, suffocating. He stumbled into the living room, his hands trembling as he tried to make sense of the terror he had just faced. His mother wasn't home yet, thankfully, but that only made the house feel emptier, more vulnerable. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Matteo paced back and forth, his thoughts racing. He had invoked the name of God, something that should have driven the presence away, but it had only made the figure laugh. Whatever this thing was, it was stronger than he had imagined, and it wasn't going to leave without a fight. The minutes ticked by like hours, each one dragging as Matteo waited for the next terrifying event. His eyes kept flicking to the hallway, expecting the basement door to burst open at any moment. The memory of the figure's twisted grin and soulless eyes haunted him, its laugh echoing in his mind. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Matteo's breath caught in his throat. He stood still, staring at the ceiling as the lights dimmed and brightened in rapid succession. The cold air returned, more intense this time, filling the house with an unmistakable chill. Something was coming. The floor creaked behind him. Matteo spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. There, standing at the far end of the hallway, was the figure. It was closer now, its form more solid, more menacing than ever before. Its black eyes gleamed in the dim light, and the grin on its face had stretched into something monstrous, as if it were feeding off his fear. Matteo's knees felt weak, but he forced himself to stand his ground. He couldn't run, not again. He needed to confront it, to stop it from taking control of his home. But how? Every prayer, every thought of protection he had relied on in the past felt useless in the face of this demonic presence. The figure began to move, its steps slow but deliberate. The air around Matteo grew colder with each passing second, and he could feel the weight of the evil pressing down on him. He clenched his fists, trying to summon the courage to speak, to do something to drive the figure away. "Leave," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "You don't belong here." The figure stopped. Its grin widened, the corners of its mouth stretching unnaturally. For a moment, Matteo thought it might respond, that it might finally leave. But then it laughed again, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the house. Matteo's pulse raced. The terror was unshakable, the presence more powerful than anything he had ever imagined. And as the figure took another step forward, its black eyes locked onto his, Matteo knew one horrifying truth: this thing wasn't going anywhere. It had claimed the house, and no amount of prayers or pleas could stop it. Vanished sister, dark return. When Marco's family moved into the century-old house, they didn't expect anything unusual. The house, nestled in the heart of a quiet, rural town, had stood for 107 years, its history etched in the creaking floors and weathered walls. It wasn't their first choice, but with the price and space, it seemed perfect for his parents, his sister Clara, and himself. They quickly settled in, marveling at the character of the old place, the ornate moldings, the towering ceilings, and the grand staircase that led up to the attic. But it didn't take long for the strange things to start. It began with the noises in the attic. Late at night, as the house fell into an eerie silence, Marco would hear faint sounds, footsteps, the soft creak of floorboards, and the occasional scrape of something heavy being dragged. His parents dismissed it as the house settling, but Marco wasn't convinced. The sounds were too deliberate, too consistent. Things escalated when they started noticing strange substances around the house. It started with a black, sticky liquid oozing from the shower head one morning. His mother assumed it was a plumbing issue, but when the same black substance began appearing in other parts of the house, on the walls, under the windowsills, and even seeping from the cracks in the floor, panic set in. They hired a plumber and a contractor, but neither could explain where the liquid was coming from. Despite these odd occurrences, life continued. That was, until the day Clara disappeared. One evening, after dinner, she went upstairs to her room, and no one saw her again. Her bed was untouched, her shoes by the door, but Clara was gone. The police were called, a search was organized, but no trace of her was found. The town rallied behind the family, offering support and searching the nearby woods, but it was as if Clara had vanished into thin air. The days turned into weeks. The house, once filled with the sounds of a bustling family, became a place of sorrow and fear. Marco spent sleepless nights listening to the strange sounds in the attic and wondering if they had anything to do with Clara's disappearance. Every time he passed her room, a cold sense of dread filled him. The black substance continued to appear, now more frequently, seeping through the walls like a creeping illness. A month passed before Clara returned. One night, Marco woke to the sound of the front door creaking open. He rushed downstairs and found her standing in the doorway, her eyes vacant and her clothes covered in dirt. She didn't speak, didn't explain where she had been. She just stood there, staring at nothing, her face pale and emotionless. His parents were overjoyed at her return, but Marco couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Clara wasn't herself. She moved mechanically, her once vibrant personality now dull and hollow. And when Marco looked into her eyes, all he saw was a dark emptiness that chilled him to his core. Something had come back with her. From the moment Clara returned, the atmosphere in the house grew darker. Marco couldn't shake the feeling that his sister was no longer the person she once was. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if each step required careful thought. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was monotone, devoid of any warmth or emotion. The once vibrant energy that filled the house had been replaced with an overwhelming sense of dread. Marco's parents were too relieved to question Clara's behavior. They were simply grateful that she was back, safe and alive. But Marco wasn't convinced. Every time he looked at his sister, a deep unease settled in his stomach. There was something off, something unnatural about her. It wasn't just her odd behavior, it was the way she seemed disconnected from reality, as though she was lost in a world only she could see. The strange occurrences in the house didn't stop. In fact, they became more frequent after Clara's return. The black liquid continued to seep from the walls, now accompanied by a foul, rotting smell that clung to the air. The sounds in the attic grew louder, more aggressive. At night, Marco could hear heavy footsteps pacing above his room, along with the occasional sound of scratching, like nails on wood. One night, Marco gathered the courage to confront Clara. He found her sitting on her bed, staring blankly at the wall, her body unnaturally still. The sight sent a shiver down his spine, but he couldn't keep ignoring the situation. He had to know what had happened to her during the month she was gone. Marco cautiously approached her. Clara didn't react to his presence, her eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. His voice came out in a nervous whisper as he asked where she had been, what had happened to her. For a long moment, Clara didn't answer. Then, slowly, she turned to face him. Her eyes were dark, as if a shadow had consumed the light in them. A faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips, but it was twisted, unnatural. The expression didn't match the face of his sister, it looked wrong, as though someone else was wearing her skin. "I'm still here," Clara said, her voice low and cold, sending a chill through Marco's body. The words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken meaning. Marco didn't know what to say, fear taking hold of him. He backed out of the room, his heart pounding in his chest, the feeling that something far more sinister had taken root in his sister stronger than ever. That night, Marco lay awake, his mind racing. Whatever had happened to Clara wasn't just a phase or trauma. It was deeper, darker. And as the hours ticked by, the house seemed to grow colder, the walls groaning as though something ancient was stirring within them. The black liquid now oozed from the ceiling above Clara's room, forming a small, dark puddle on the floor. Marco knew it wasn't just a plumbing issue. Something unnatural was happening, something tied to Clara's return. And he feared it was only going to get worse. The days after Clara's chilling words passed in a blur of fear and unease for Marco. The house no longer felt like a home. The dark energy that seemed to follow Clara had seeped into every corner, and the black liquid continued to spread throughout the house. It was no longer just confined to the walls or the shower. Now, it oozed from cracks in the floorboards and dripped from the ceiling, as if the house itself was bleeding. Clara's behavior grew stranger with each passing day. She would disappear for hours, only to reappear suddenly, often standing in the middle of the hallway, her eyes vacant and her expression unreadable. She barely spoke to anyone, and when she did, her voice was distant, as though she were speaking from another world. The once vibrant girl Marco knew had been replaced by someone, or something, else entirely. One evening, Marco woke to the sound of whispering. At first, he thought it was a dream, but as he sat up in bed, the whispers became clearer, more insistent. They were coming from the attic. His heart pounded in his chest as he listened, trying to make sense of the strange voices. It sounded like more than one person, but the words were garbled, as though they were being spoken in a language he didn't understand. Marco knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Something had happened to Clara, and it was connected to the attic, to the black liquid, to the strange occurrences that had plagued the house since they moved in. He had to find out what was hiding in the shadows, even if the truth terrified him. Grabbing a flashlight, Marco made his way to the attic door. The house was silent, the only sound the faint creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. His hands trembled as he reached for the doorknob. The air around him felt thick and cold, as if something unseen was watching him, waiting for him to open the door. With a deep breath, Marco turned the knob and pushed the door open. The attic stairs creaked under his weight as he ascended, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air in the attic was stale, filled with the smell of dust and decay. As he reached the top of the stairs, the whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a thick fog. Marco's heart raced as he shone his flashlight into the far corner of the attic, and his breath caught in his throat. There, huddled in the shadows, was Clara. She sat on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes wide and unblinking. The black liquid pooled around her, seeping from the walls and ceiling, creating a dark, oily circle that surrounded her. She looked up at Marco, and for a moment, her eyes flashed with something otherworldly, something not human. "I told you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the dripping liquid. "I'm still here." Marco's blood ran cold. This wasn't his sister. Whatever had returned in her place was something dark, something ancient. And as he stood frozen in fear, the attic seemed to close in around him, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. He had uncovered the darkness, but now he feared it was too late to stop it. Marco could barely breathe as he stood in the attic, staring at Clara, or what used to be his sister. The black liquid oozed from the walls, dripping like dark ink onto the floor, pooling around her. The air was heavy with a malevolent energy, and the whispers that surrounded them were almost deafening now, filling his mind with a strange, primal fear he had never experienced before. Clara's eyes locked onto his, and for the briefest moment, he saw a flicker of recognition, a glimmer of the girl she once was. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a darkness that felt ancient and evil. The thing that had returned in Clara's place was not human. Marco knew that now. And whatever it was, it had no intention of leaving. His mind raced, desperately searching for answers. How had this happened? What had Clara brought back with her? And most importantly, how could he stop it before it consumed them all? The oppressive weight of the attic pressed down on him, making it difficult to think, difficult to breathe. The house itself felt alive, as though it were feeding off the darkness that now dwelled within it. Marco took a step closer to Clara, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Clara," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing whispers that filled the room. But she didn't respond. She just stared at him with those empty, dark eyes, her body unnaturally still. The only movement was the slow, rhythmic drip of the black liquid from the ceiling. Suddenly, Clara began to speak, but the words weren't her own. The language was foreign, guttural, and filled with an unnatural cadence that sent chills down Marco's spine. The whispers around him grew louder, as if they were responding to her, feeding off her words. Marco's heart raced, a sense of impending doom settling over him. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand there and watch as the darkness consumed his sister, as it took over their home. But what could he do? The darkness was too strong, too ancient. The black liquid began to spread across the attic floor, creeping toward him like a living thing, and Marco could feel its cold presence wrapping around him, suffocating him. And then, just as the whispers reached a fever pitch, everything stopped. The attic fell silent. The liquid stopped dripping. The oppressive weight lifted slightly. Marco's breath came in ragged gasps as he stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened. Clara's eyes flickered, and for the first time in what felt like hours, she blinked. Slowly, she stood, her movements still stiff and unnatural, but there was something different now. The dark presence that had filled the attic seemed to recede, pulling away from her, retreating back into the shadows. Clara's gaze softened, and for the briefest moment, Marco thought he had his sister back. But then she smiled, a twisted, hollow grin that chilled him to his core. "I'm still here," she whispered again, but this time, the words were filled with something far more terrifying. It wasn't Clara speaking. It was the darkness, the ancient evil that had taken root in her, now fully awakened and in control. Marco stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He had uncovered the truth, but it was too late. Whatever had taken Clara wasn't leaving. And now, it wanted him too. Evil awakens in the family home. The house had always felt a little off to Felipe. Ever since his family moved in, there was an unsettling atmosphere hanging over it. The creaks in the floorboards, the occasional flicker of the lights, and the cold drafts that swept through the rooms all contributed to the eerie feeling. But it wasn't until they discovered the symbols that the true nature of the house revealed itself. It started with the basement. Felipe's father had been cleaning out the old storage room when he noticed strange markings carved into the stone walls. At first, they thought it was just graffiti left by previous owners, but the symbols were unlike anything they had ever seen. Twisted, ancient patterns snaked across the walls, each one etched deep into the stone with a precision that sent chills down Felipe's spine. As the days went on, more symbols began to appear in other parts of the house. Some were faint, barely visible under layers of paint and wallpaper, while others seemed fresh, as though they had been recently carved. The symbols covered the walls in every room, curved lines, strange geometric shapes, and spirals that seemed to pulsate with an unnatural energy. The unease that Felipe had felt since moving in had intensified. It was as if the house itself was alive, its walls breathing with the malevolent energy of the symbols. Then came the black substance. One morning, Felipe's mother went to wash her hands in the bathroom, only to find thick, black liquid pouring from the faucet. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, thick, oily, and foul-smelling. It stained the sink and left an acrid stench in the air. No matter how much they scrubbed or called in plumbers to fix the pipes, the liquid continued to seep from the faucets throughout the house, a constant, dark reminder of something far more sinister at play. Felipe's younger sister, Sofia, was the first to notice the figures. She would wake in the middle of the night, screaming that she had seen people walking through the house. At first, their parents dismissed it as nightmares, but Sofia's descriptions were too vivid, too detailed. She spoke of shadowy figures standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with empty eyes. As the nights wore on, the figures became more frequent, their presence felt throughout the house. Felipe, too, began to sense them, catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye, shadows that vanished the moment he turned to look. The house was no longer just eerie. It had become a place of terror, and no one could ignore it any longer. It was Felipe's father who suggested calling the local priest. With the symbols, the black liquid, and the strange occurrences escalating, they knew they needed help. The house was no longer safe, and they could all feel the darkness creeping in. But what they didn't realize was that the true source of the evil wasn't the house itself. It was already inside one of them. When Father Miguel arrived at the house, the air seemed to shift. He was an older man, his face lined with years of experience, and he carried himself with a calm authority that gave the family some comfort. But even as he stepped through the front door, Felipe could see the slight hesitation in his eyes. Father Miguel had performed countless blessings over the years, but there was something about this house, something about the symbols, that unsettled even him. Father Miguel spent the first part of the day examining the house. He moved from room to room, his hands tracing the strange symbols etched into the walls, his face grim and serious. The family followed him in silence, their anxiety growing with each passing minute. When he reached the basement, Father Miguel stood in front of the largest symbol, his brow furrowed as he murmured a quiet prayer under his breath. The symbols, Father Miguel explained, are not just markings. They are part of an ancient ritual. I don't know what kind, but they were meant to summon something. Something dark. His words sent a chill through Felipe's spine. The priest then pulled out a small vial of holy water, ready to begin the purification of the house. It was the first step in ridding their home of whatever malevolent force had been stirred. As Father Miguel began his blessing, moving from room to room, the atmosphere in the house seemed to change. The air felt heavy, thick with tension, and the lights flickered as if the house itself was resisting the cleansing. The black substance continued to drip from the faucets, but now it bubbled and hissed as the holy water was sprinkled around. Felipe couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, lurking just beyond the light, waiting for the right moment to strike. The closer Father Miguel came to Sophia's room, the more agitated she became. She had always been quiet, but now she was restless, pacing back and forth and mumbling under her breath. Felipe's parents tried to calm her down, but it was clear something was wrong. The closer the priest got, the more disturbed Sophia seemed to be. Her eyes, usually so full of life, were now dark, hollow, and distant. When Father Miguel finally entered her room, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Sophia stood in the middle of the room, her back to the priest, her small frame shaking as if something was trying to escape her body. Father Miguel approached her cautiously, holding the vial of holy water in one hand, a cross in the other. As soon as the first drop of holy water touched Sophia's skin, she let out an ear-piercing scream. Her body convulsed, and she fell to the floor, writhing in pain as if the water was burning her. The room filled with a horrible stench, and the shadows on the walls seemed to grow, twisting and writhing in the dim light. Felipe watched in horror as his sister's face twisted in agony, her eyes rolling back in her head. His heart pounded in his chest, and he realized, with dawning terror, that whatever evil had been summoned by the symbols was now inside Sophia. And it wasn't going to let her go easily. Sophia's screams echoed through the house, each one more agonizing than the last. Felipe's parents rushed to her side, but Father Miguel motioned for them to stay back. His face was pale, his lips moving in silent prayer as he watched Sophia writhe on the floor, her body twisting unnaturally as if controlled by some unseen force. The air in the room was thick with tension, heavy with the presence of something dark and malevolent. Felipe stood frozen at the doorway, his eyes wide with terror. He had always thought possession was something that only happened in movies, but now he was watching it unfold right before his eyes. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse and move, reacting to Sophia's screams. Every time Father Miguel sprinkled more holy water, Sophia's body convulsed violently, her voice reaching a pitch that sent shivers down his spine. "Sophia," Felipe whispered, hoping against hope that his sister could still hear him, that some part of her was still there. But the girl on the floor wasn't his sister anymore. Her eyes, once full of life and innocence, were now black voids, staring at him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Father Miguel continued his prayers, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. He called out to the dark presence, demanding that it leave Sophia's body, that it release its hold on her soul. But the thing inside Sophia only laughed, a deep, guttural sound that didn't belong to a girl her age. It was the voice of something ancient, something evil. "You can't have her," Father Miguel said, his voice louder now, filled with a resolve that seemed to cut through the oppressive atmosphere. He stepped closer, holding the cross out in front of him, the holy water still dripping from his fingers. "In the name of God, leave this child." For a moment, everything went still. The air in the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to shrink back, as if retreating from the priest's words. But just as hope began to flicker in Felipe's chest, Sophia's body arched off the floor, her mouth opening in a silent scream. The black liquid that had been dripping from the faucets now poured from her mouth, staining the floor beneath her. Felipe's mother let out a gasp, her hand covering her mouth as she watched in horror. His father stood frozen, his face pale and drained of color. No one knew what to do. This was beyond their comprehension, beyond anything they had ever imagined. Suddenly, Sophia's body collapsed back to the floor, her breathing ragged and uneven. For a brief moment, the room was silent, the tension lifting slightly. But Felipe knew it wasn't over. The thing inside his sister wasn't done yet. Father Miguel knelt beside Sophia, his hand resting gently on her forehead as he whispered a final prayer. The black liquid around her began to bubble and hiss, and the shadows in the room grew darker once again, closing in around them. Whatever ancient evil had been awakened by the symbols was still there, lurking in the corners of the room, waiting for its chance to strike again. Felipe's heart raced as he realized that the battle for Sophia's soul had only just begun. The room was suffocating, the oppressive darkness pressing down on everyone as Sophia lay motionless on the floor. Felipe's heart pounded in his chest as he watched Father Miguel hover over her, continuing his prayers. The priest's words were steady, but the exhaustion in his voice was clear. Whatever ancient evil had taken hold of Sophia wasn't giving up easily, and they all knew it. Suddenly, Sophia's eyes shot open, and Felipe's stomach dropped. Her once black eyes now glowed a deep, unnatural red. She pushed herself up from the floor in one fluid motion, faster than any human should be able to move. The air around her seemed to shift, growing colder, more dangerous. The black liquid that had poured from her earlier began to swirl around her feet, as if alive. Father Miguel stepped back, clutching the cross tightly in his hand. He began a new round of prayers, louder this time, his voice filled with urgency. "Leave this child," he commanded again, his tone firm but laced with fear. But the thing inside Sophia wasn't leaving. If anything, it was growing stronger. Sophia stood completely still, her eyes glowing with an unholy light. Her face twisted into a grin that didn't belong to her, her lips curling in a way that sent a chill down Felipe's spine. Then, in a voice that was not her own, she spoke. "She's mine now," the thing inside her hissed, the words sending shivers through the room. The shadows around her seemed to pulse with every syllable, as though they were part of her, feeding off the evil that had taken root in her soul. Felipe's mother began to cry, her sobs breaking the silence of the room, while his father stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. Felipe, too, was terrified, but something deep inside him refused to give up. This was his sister, his family. He couldn't let this evil take her. Father Miguel continued to pray, his voice growing louder, stronger, as he held the cross toward Sophia. The room seemed to tremble under the weight of the battle unfolding before them. The black liquid began to bubble and hiss once more, and the air was filled with the sound of it splattering across the floor. Felipe stepped forward, his legs shaky but determined. He reached out for Sophia, calling her name softly, hoping to reach whatever part of her was still there. "Sophia, come back," he pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're here. You're not alone." For a moment, nothing happened. The thing inside her grinned wider, as if mocking his words. But then, something changed. The glow in Sophia's eyes flickered, just for a second, and her body trembled. Father Miguel noticed it too. He took a step forward, sprinkling more holy water as he continued his prayers. The evil inside her screamed, a high-pitched, guttural sound that filled the room. The shadows recoiled, shrinking away from the light of the cross, and the black liquid began to evaporate into the air. Sophia's body convulsed one last time before collapsing to the floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Father Miguel knelt beside Sophia, checking her pulse. He sighed in relief, a quiet prayer of thanks escaping his lips. She was alive. The evil was gone, at least for now. But as Felipe knelt beside his sister, cradling her head in his hands, he couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness hadn't truly left. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance. and the symbols etched into the walls, silent and menacing, remained as a reminder that the battle was far from over. The shadow that haunted us. It was supposed to be a fun, spooky way to celebrate Leo's 11th birthday. He had always been fascinated by ghost stories and the supernatural, and his group of friends shared the same curiosity. So when one of them suggested they try a séance to make the day memorable, Leo was all for it. The idea of connecting with spirits, even if they didn't believe in it, was thrilling in a way only a group of kids could appreciate. They gathered in the living room after dark, the curtains drawn to block out any light. In the center of the room sat a small, round table covered with a cloth, and on it, several candles flickered softly. Each friend sat in a circle around the table, hands joined, their faces lit by the orange glow of the candles. The mood was light at first, nervous laughter and whispers filled the air as they settled in. Leo had seen enough movies to know the basics of how a séance was supposed to go. He spoke up first, his voice shaking slightly from excitement. "Is there anyone here who wishes to speak to us?" The room fell into an expectant silence. The candles flickered, but nothing happened. For the next few minutes, they continued calling out to any spirits, but all they received in return was silence. The kids started to giggle, relieved that nothing supernatural seemed to be happening. But then, just as they were about to give up, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. The warmth from the candles no longer reached them, and a cold breeze seemed to sweep through the house, though the windows were shut tight. Everyone's laughter stopped. Leo exchanged nervous glances with his friends, feeling a tension settle over the group. They all felt it, the shift in the room, the change in the air. The candles began to flicker more violently, their flames sputtering as if struggling to stay lit. A shadow passed across the room, quick and faint, but enough to make their hearts race. Leo's friend Olivia gasped, her hand tightening in his. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, the candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in immediately. They scrambled to their feet, shouting for the lights, for the candles, for something to break the suffocating darkness. But as they moved, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over them. It wasn't just fear, it was as if something had entered the room, something cold, malevolent, and dangerous. Leo's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as he felt the weight of the presence pressing down on him. His heart pounded in his chest, and he could hear his friends whispering, crying, trying to make sense of what was happening. But no one dared move, as though they feared that whatever had entered the room would notice them if they did. The séance, which had started as a game, had awakened something. And now, they were trapped in its presence. The darkness that filled the room was suffocating, pressing down on Leo and his friends like a heavy blanket. No one dared to move or speak, as though the slightest sound might provoke the entity that had entered their séance. The air felt thick, cold, and oppressive, and Leo could barely catch his breath. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. For what felt like an eternity, they sat frozen in the dark, listening to the sound of their own shallow breaths. Then, suddenly, there was a sound, a soft, low whisper that echoed through the room. It wasn't coming from any of them. The voice was distant, yet it seemed to be all around them, a faint, chilling murmur that sent shivers down their spines. Leo's skin prickled with fear. He strained to hear what the voice was saying, but the words were garbled, like a distant conversation carried on the wind. He looked around, but he could barely make out the shapes of his friends in the dark. Olivia whimpered beside him, clutching his arm tightly, and he could feel her trembling. What's happening?" whispered Alex, his voice barely audible over the eerie whispers. No one answered. They didn't know. All Leo knew was that something unnatural was in the room with them, something they had unintentionally invited. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then, without warning, one of the chairs scraped across the floor, the sharp sound cutting through the silence. Leo flinched, his heart skipping a beat. It felt as though the very room had come alive, as though the presence was making itself known. Before anyone could react, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing any hope of lighting the candles again. The windows rattled, and the room grew even colder, as if the warmth of the house had been sucked away. The presence wasn't just there, it was angry. Leo's breath quickened as the weight of the entity pressed down on him, making it hard to think, hard to move. He wanted to run, to scream, to escape the house, but something kept him rooted to the spot. A sense of dread coursed through him, freezing him in place. Olivia whispered his name, her voice barely a breath, but Leo couldn't respond. The whispers were all around them now, a sinister chorus of voices speaking in a language none of them understood. It was as though the air itself had become thick with fear. Suddenly, there was a loud thud, a sound that reverberated through the room, like something heavy had slammed against the wall. Everyone jumped, their fear turning into panic. Leo could hear Alex scrambling in the dark, his hands searching for the light switch, for something that could bring them back to normalcy. Just as Alex's hand reached the switch, the lights flickered on, revealing the room bathed in an eerie, unnatural glow. But the relief was short-lived. In the corner of the room, they all saw it, a dark, shadowy figure standing motionless, watching them. Its shape was vague, but its presence was undeniable. The room seemed to hum with its power, and a wave of terror washed over them. Leo's voice caught in his throat as he stared at the figure, his body frozen with fear. They had called it, and now it was here. The séance had gone terribly wrong, and the entity that stood before them was far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. The dark figure in the corner loomed over them, its presence heavy and suffocating. Leo's pulse raced as he stood frozen, his friends huddled close together in sheer terror. The temperature in the room had dropped even further, and the air seemed to vibrate with a menacing energy. No one dared to move or speak. The entity's shadow stretched unnaturally across the walls, and it was clear to everyone that something malevolent had been summoned. Just when the fear seemed unbearable, the door to the room swung open with a loud creak. Leo's aunt, Clara, burst in, her eyes wide with urgency. She had sensed something was terribly wrong from the other side of the house. As soon as she stepped into the room, she saw the fear on their faces, and her gaze immediately shifted to the shadowy figure lurking in the corner. Without hesitation, Clara rushed to the table, her presence bringing a strange sense of calm to the room. Leo had always known that his aunt was different. She had a deep connection with the spiritual world, often speaking of energies and rituals, though the family never took it seriously. But now, in the face of something truly terrifying, Clara seemed to know exactly what to do. "Stay together," she ordered, her voice firm but calm. Her eyes never left the figure in the corner as she reached into her bag and pulled out a small bundle of herbs tied together with string. It was sage, Leo realized, a tool often used for purification rituals. Clara lit the bundle, and a thick, fragrant smoke filled the room. The shadowy figure seemed to shift, its form becoming less defined as the smoke curled through the air. Clara moved around the room, wafting the smoke toward the entity, murmuring words of protection under her breath. Leo couldn't make out what she was saying, but the effect was immediate. The air in the room began to clear, the oppressive weight of the entity slowly lifting. But the entity wasn't leaving without a fight. As Clara continued her ritual, the figure in the corner grew more agitated. The whispers that had filled the room intensified, swirling around them like a whirlwind of voices. Leo could feel the tension rising, the entity's anger palpable. It wasn't happy about being forced out. Clara paused in front of the shadow, holding the burning sage in one hand and a small vial of water in the other. She sprinkled the water across the room, her words growing louder, more commanding. The figure let out a low, guttural growl, and for a moment, the lights flickered violently. The room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and Leo's heart skipped a beat as he watched the figure begin to dissolve, its form breaking apart in the smoke. The candles on the table reignited, their flames dancing wildly as the entity fought to remain in the room. But Clara stood her ground, her voice unwavering. With a final wave of the sage, the shadow seemed to collapse in on itself, disappearing into the smoke as though it had never been there. The room fell silent, the air still heavy with the memory of what had just happened. Clara stood at the center, her breath steady, her face pale but calm. The entity was gone, but the fear it had left behind lingered in the room, etched into the minds of everyone present. Leo and his friends exchanged shaken glances, the reality of the séance consequences sinking in. The house was still, but the sense of dread hadn't entirely disappeared. They had called something dangerous, and though it was gone for now, Leo knew it had left its mark. The silence that followed the entity's disappearance was heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Leo's legs felt weak, and he slowly sank into a chair, his body trembling from the adrenaline and fear. His friends, too, were shaken, their faces pale and their eyes wide with disbelief. The dark presence was gone, but the memory of it lingered, a cold reminder of the danger they had invited into their lives. Aunt Clara, still holding the smoldering sage, wiped the sweat from her brow and turned to the group. "It's over, for now," she said quietly, her voice firm but filled with concern. "But you need to understand, what you did tonight opened a door. And sometimes, those doors are very difficult to close." Leo nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The weight of what they had done, what he had led them into, settled heavily on his shoulders. The séance had been a game, a fun idea to scare each other, but it had spiraled into something far more real and terrifying than any of them could have imagined. As Clara began cleaning up the candles and putting away her ritual items, Leo's friends started to gather their things. The sense of relief that the entity was gone did little to ease the tension that remained between them. They were all still trying to process what had happened, what they had seen and felt in that room. None of them would ever forget the shadowy figure, the cold whispers, or the overwhelming fear that had gripped them. Leo glanced over at Olivia, who had been the most shaken of them all. She sat quietly on the couch, staring at the floor, her hands still trembling. Alex stood by the door, his back turned to the room as if he couldn't bear to look back at the scene of their ordeal. The fun and excitement of the evening had evaporated, replaced by a deep sense of dread. "Will it come back?" Leo finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara paused, considering her answer carefully. "If you don't disturb it again, no. But you have to be careful from now on. This house, this place, it's seen things you don't want to invite back. What happened tonight was a warning." Leo swallowed hard, his mind racing with the memories of the séance. He had always been drawn to ghost stories, fascinated by the unknown, but now that he had come face to face with it, he wasn't sure if he'd ever be able to look at the supernatural the same way again. The entity may have been banished, but the fear remained, deep and unshakable. As his friends left the house, their goodbyes were brief, almost mechanical. No one said much, they didn't need to. The experience had bonded them in a way that words couldn't capture. They had all felt the same terror, and now, each of them carried a piece of it with them. That night, as Leo lay in bed, the events of the evening replayed in his mind over and over again. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadowy figure in the corner, heard the low whispers that filled the room, and felt the cold grip of the entity's presence. The candles flickering out, the oppressive darkness, it was all too real. And even though Aunt Clara had cleansed the house, Leo couldn't shake the feeling that something had stayed behind, something unseen, waiting for another chance to be called. Banishing the family curse. Lucas and his younger sister, Julia, had always loved spending weekends at their father's house. After their parents separated, it became a comforting routine, a break from the usual, a chance to explore their dad's spacious, older home nestled at the edge of town. The house had character, with its creaky floors and high ceilings, but it also had a history that neither of them fully understood. That history would soon begin to reveal itself in terrifying ways. It started with small things. At first, Lucas noticed lights flickering at odd moments, especially at night. Julia, who had always been more sensitive to their surroundings, complained of cold spots in the house, even though their father dismissed it as drafts from the old windows. But the strange occurrences became more difficult to ignore. One night, as Lucas lay in bed, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow and deliberate. He assumed it was his father checking on them, but the steps never reached his door. Instead, they stopped just outside, lingering for a moment before fading into silence. When Lucas got up to check, no one was there. The hallway was empty, and his father's door remained closed. Julia, too, began to have unsettling experiences. She would wake up in the middle of the night, terrified, saying she had seen a shadowy figure standing in the corner of her room. She described it as tall and dark, with no distinct features but an overwhelming presence that filled the air with dread. Lucas tried to comfort her, telling her it was just a bad dream, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. As the months passed, the figure seemed to appear more frequently. It was never fully visible, always lurking just out of sight, but Lucas could feel its presence. It watched them, followed them through the house, always just a step behind. Their father, however, remained oblivious to the strange events. He became more distant, his mood shifting from calm to erratic with alarming speed. Lucas and Julia began to fear not only the figure but also their father. He started acting differently, short-tempered, prone to sudden outbursts of anger. His once warm and affectionate demeanor had grown cold. It was as if something had taken hold of him, feeding off the dark energy that seemed to permeate the house. The nights were the worst. Lucas would lie awake, listening to the sounds of the house, the creaking floorboards, the low hum of the wind outside, but there was always something more. The footsteps, the soft tapping at the windows, the feeling of being watched from the shadows. The presence, whatever it was, wasn't going away. It had latched onto them, and no matter where they went, it followed. One evening, as Lucas and Julia sat quietly in the living room, they both saw it. The figure, standing at the far end of the hallway, just out of the light. Its form was barely discernible, but it was there, watching them. The air grew cold, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled the room. Neither of them could move or speak. The figure was no longer just a shadow. It was real, and it had no intention of leaving. As the weeks passed, the figure's presence became more invasive, as if it was feeding off the fear that gripped Lucas and Julia. They tried to avoid the house as much as possible, but they had no choice but to return every weekend. Each time they arrived, the oppressive energy felt heavier, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. It wasn't long before their father's behavior grew even more alarming. At first, it was subtle. He would snap at them over small things, his patience wearing thin. Lucas, who had always been close to his father, noticed the change more than anyone. His dad would go from being quiet and withdrawn to suddenly exploding in fits of anger over the smallest mistakes. Once, when Julia accidentally knocked over a glass of water at the dinner table, their father's reaction was swift and severe. He slammed his fist on the table, his eyes wild with fury, shouting words that neither Lucas nor Julia had ever heard from him before. The man sitting across from them wasn't the father they knew. He was someone else, someone darker, as if the shadow that had been following them had somehow taken root inside him. The violent outbursts continued. Lucas tried to shield Julia from it, comforting her when their father's temper flared. But he could feel it too, something was wrong with the house, something that had changed their father. The shadowy figure still appeared at night, standing at the foot of their beds or lurking in the corners of the rooms. It no longer waited in the hallway or the periphery of their vision. Now, it was in their personal space, invading their lives. Their father seemed to grow weaker with each passing day, as if the figure was draining him of his strength and warmth. He became gaunt, his face pale and lined with exhaustion, his once sharp eyes clouded with something dark. His moods were unpredictable, swinging from cold detachment to frightening rage. Lucas feared what his father might do during one of his outbursts. The anger was unnatural, almost as if something else was controlling him. Julia was the first to suggest that the figure and their father's behavior were connected. She told Lucas about the strange whispers she had started hearing, low and unintelligible, but ever-present when their father was near. She was convinced that the figure wasn't just haunting the house, it was inside their father, pushing him toward violence. Lucas wanted to believe she was wrong, but deep down, he knew she was right. Whatever was in the house had taken hold of their father, and it wasn't going to let go easily. One evening, after another violent outburst from their father, Lucas made a decision. He couldn't stand by and watch this darkness consume their family. Something had to change, and if their father wouldn't ask for help, Lucas would do it for him. Lucas reached out to his aunt, their father's sister, who had always been more spiritual than the rest of the family. She knew things about the old house, things about spirits. When he explained what had been happening, her response was immediate. She told Lucas that they needed to intervene before it was too late. The presence in the house was more than just a spirit. It was something darker, something that thrived on fear and anger. It had to be removed, or it would destroy them all. The decision to involve their aunt came as a relief to Lucas. He had always trusted her, knowing she had a deep understanding of the spiritual world. When she arrived at the house, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The heavy, oppressive feeling that had hung in the air for so long seemed to pull back slightly, as if the presence within the house sensed what was coming. Julia stayed close to Lucas, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear, while their father remained in his bedroom, unaware of what was about to happen. Their aunt wasted no time. She walked through the house, moving slowly and deliberately, taking in the space, her lips murmuring prayers as she went. She carried with her a bundle of sage, which she lit as she began the ritual. Thick, fragrant smoke filled the air, swirling around them as she moved from room to room, her face serious and focused. The house creaked under the weight of the ritual, the floors groaning as if resisting her efforts to cleanse it. Lucas and Julia followed closely behind, their hearts racing with every step. Their aunt was calm, but Lucas could see the intensity in her eyes. This was more than just a spiritual cleansing, it was a battle. The figure that had followed them for so long was not just a haunting, it was a malevolent force, something that had grown stronger over time. And now, it had its claws deep in their father. As they approached their father's room, Lucas felt a wave of dread wash over him. The door was closed, but the air around it was cold, unnaturally so. His aunt paused, taking a deep breath before opening the door. Inside, their father lay on the bed, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken. He didn't stir as they entered, but the air in the room was thick with the presence of the shadow. Lucas could feel it, standing just out of sight, waiting. Their aunt began the ritual, her voice growing louder as she recited prayers of protection and cleansing. She moved around the room, the smoke from the sage swirling in the air, thickening as it reached the far corner of the room. Lucas's heart pounded as the atmosphere grew tense, the presence in the room pushing back against the ritual. The shadow was there, he couldn't see it, but he could feel it, pressing down on them, growing angrier with each word of the prayer. Suddenly, their father stirred. His eyes opened, but they were not the eyes of the man Lucas had known. They were dark, filled with something cold and foreign. His father's body tensed, and he let out a low, guttural growl, unlike any sound Lucas had ever heard from him before. The shadow was fighting back, using their father as its vessel. But their aunt didn't waver. She stepped closer, her voice rising as she commanded the dark presence to leave. The tension in the room grew unbearable, the very walls seeming to pulse with the force of the battle. Their father thrashed on the bed, his face twisted in agony, as if something inside him was being torn apart. And then, with a final shout, their aunt threw the last of the holy water into the air, her voice ringing out one last prayer. The room fell silent, the air suddenly still. The shadow was gone, and their father collapsed onto the bed, breathing heavily, his body limp with exhaustion. But the presence, the thing that had haunted them for years, had finally been forced out. The silence that followed the ritual was overwhelming. Lucas stood frozen at the edge of the room, his heart still racing, unsure of what had just happened. His father lay motionless on the bed, his face pale and gaunt, but peaceful for the first time in weeks. The oppressive darkness that had plagued their home for so long seemed to have lifted, replaced by a strange, calming stillness. It was as if the very air in the house had been cleansed. Their aunt stood at the foot of the bed, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion, the sage smoke slowly dissipating into the air. Julia clung to Lucas's side, her eyes wide and tearful, but for the first time, there was no fear in them. The shadow, the presence that had followed them, was gone. They could all feel it. Their father stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked, confused, as if waking from a long, terrible dream. For a moment, he didn't recognize them, his gaze distant and foggy. But then, slowly, his eyes focused, and the man they knew, the man who had been buried under weeks of anger and darkness, finally returned. "Dad?" Lucas whispered, stepping forward cautiously. His father's eyes met his, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was clarity in them. He was back, truly back. The shadow that had clung to him, that had twisted his mind and body, was no longer there. Tears welled up in Lucas's eyes as his father sat up, weak but conscious, his face softening into the faintest of smiles. I'm sorry," his father said, his voice hoarse but sincere. The guilt in his eyes was evident, but Lucas shook his head, stepping closer to wrap his arms around him. There was no need for an apology. What had happened wasn't his father's fault. It had been something else, something far darker, that had taken control of their home and their lives. The days that followed were filled with quiet recovery. Their father regained his strength slowly, and with each passing day, the house felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. There were no more cold spots, no more flickering lights, no more shadowy figures lurking in the corners. The oppressive atmosphere had disappeared, and the house, once filled with fear, was now filled with hope. But the experience had left its mark on all of them. Julia, though relieved, had become more withdrawn, her once playful energy subdued by the trauma of what they had gone through. Lucas often caught her staring at the corners of the room, as if half expecting the shadow to return. And though their father was back to his old self, there were moments where the guilt crept into his eyes, a reminder of the dark force that had nearly destroyed their family. Their aunt, too, stayed close, visiting often to ensure that the house remained free of any lingering energy. She reminded them that the battle they had fought was not just physical, but spiritual, and that vigilance was necessary to keep the darkness at bay. But despite her warnings, there was a sense of peace in the house, a feeling that the worst was behind them. As the weeks turned into months, life slowly returned to normal. The strange events that had once plagued their lives became distant memories, stories whispered only between Lucas and Julia in the quiet moments before sleep. The shadow, the dark figure that had haunted them for so long, had been banished. But even though the house was free of the presence that had once consumed it, Lucas knew that they would never truly forget. The fear, the terror of those nights, would stay with them forever. They had faced the darkness, and though they had survived, the experience had changed them all. And while the shadow may have been gone, they would always live with the memory of the figure that had followed them for so long. As the last shadow fades and the echoes of these terrifying stories settle, one question remains: which nightmare will haunt you tonight? Was it the séance gone wrong, the cursed doll, or the father consumed by a dark force? Or perhaps the figure lurking in the attic that refuses to leave? Let us know in the comments which story chilled you the most, and if you've had your own encounter with the paranormal, we want to hear it. You're part of our haunted family now, so don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Every click helps us grow. And before you go, there's more horror waiting for you in our next video. Dare to explore it? See you there, if you're brave enough.